Yes, sir.
Think about myself.
What is the highest attendance you have?
The highest attendance at a single service? Since I've been here or ever? Since I've been here, you probably would go with either a Christmas Eve or an Easter, and we've probably touched in the nearly 200-ish range, would be my guess. 180, 190, 200, somewhere in there. We could look in the book and find it pretty quickly. But yeah, it would be either a Christmas Eve, especially when we only had the one Christmas Eve service.
235.
235, we've hit that? Yeah. That's pretty much, so we can bring out extra chairs. That's using all the choir loft as seating. Extra chairs in the back, sometimes even on the end of the aisle. Yep. So it gets a little squeezy when that's the number. But this on is not on. Hello. Now I'm on. All right, very good. So, Joshua and Judges, the long-awaited Sunday school that almost didn't happen. So here we are, and if you tried to do the homework, I apologize. I sent you on a wild goose chase with the first passage here. That should be Numbers, not 3, but Numbers 13. Then that's verses 1 through 3 and verses 25 through 33. Not chapters 25 through 33. So a few different things that could have misled you. But that being said, as we're surveying this section, a little bit of a reminder of where we're at, and then I'm going to split you up and have you look at some different passages, and we'll pool all our answers together. Remember, we're using covenants as the sort of the chapters of Old Testament history. So God created humans, so the covenant was with Adam and Eve. Anybody remember what the covenant terms were? What were they supposed to do? Make babies. Yep, be fruitful and multiply. And they were supposed to not do what? Eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so they did both of those things, but they're only supposed to do one of them. So they did make babies, but they also ate from the tree, and they were banished, and we saw the punishment and the rescue from sin. Then with Noah, as evil spread, as God had warned that it would, then God wiped out the whole earth except Noah's family. Covenant was renewed. We had the rainbow as the sign of the covenant. There's only one instruction, and that was to make babies. There aren't very many humans. Go make some more. And so that was the covenant with Noah. Then, so the covenant is still technically both of those times with all of the human race, right? Adam is the whole human race when God makes that covenant with Adam and Eve. Noah's family is the whole human race at that point. What must that have been like? But God has this covenant with the whole human race. Then with Abraham, God chooses for himself a special people among the human race. We saw all the ways that that was unexpected because Abraham doesn't have people. Abraham's 75 years old with no kids at all. And yet God promises, like the stars in the sky or the sand on the seashore, so will be your descendants. Promises him a great nation, great name, that he'll bless the whole world through him. And the promised land. He promises the land where Abraham was at the time. He says the time is not yet. The wickedness of its inhabitants has not yet reached its full measure. Then we remember Abraham has Isaac. Isaac has Jacob. Jacob's name is changed to Israel after he wrestled with God. And then it's through Israel's son Joseph. We studied Joseph's life. They end up in Egypt. And so numerous they end up enslaved, and then we saw with the Exodus, God making the covenant with Moses after he had brought the people out of that slavery. So that gets you as far as we've gotten. There's the quick and dirty 30-second Old Testament history to get you as far as we are today. And then so we've read pretty intensively through Genesis. Exodus, we've just hit some of the highlights. We're skipping Leviticus entirely as far as our reading goes. You are welcome to go ahead and read it. Those are all of the Levitical laws. That's why it's named Leviticus. It's all of the instructions about the worship and practice in the temple. And it is kind of fascinating to take a look at. What I would say is if you are aiming to read through the Bible, the whole thing, don't let Leviticus bog you down too much. It's okay if you're kind of skimming your way through. Because these are rules that applied very specifically for a very specific period of time. So don't let that be what derails you. I can say the same thing, particularly for the beginning of the book of Numbers, which starts with the lengthy genealogies. Remember, those are real people. So if you had lived in that culture, those wouldn't have been meaningless. How many of you have ever been to one of the big war memorials, like down on the mall in D.C.? And there's always people there, right, with the paper, and those names are very, very meaningful to someone. Now, granted, we're talking about names that lived and died thousands of years ago. But even to this day, there are plenty of people. Anybody in the room ever done the Ancestry.com or any of the genealogy? Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating stuff, right? Imagine if those names were actually in the Bible. If you could find the Bible verse and say, hey, go look at Numbers chapter 2, verse 9. That's my great-great-grandfather or whatever. Wouldn't that be pretty awesome? So understand how meaningful it was at the time. Also, don't get derailed by it now. Again, these are long lists of names. I don't think God's going to quiz us when we get to heaven. So it's okay to take a look, see what the value was for the time, be kind of familiar what's happening, but you do not have to be memorizing these particular verses. However, don't underestimate, a lot of action happens in Numbers as well. The fact that it starts with a bunch of lists of genealogies actually covers the fact that Numbers picks up historically from Exodus. So Numbers is basically the story of the people in their wandering toward the Promised Land. So that's why we're going to pick up with Numbers chapter 13, That's going to be the first section that we're going to look at. So I just said that as though we're all looking at that right now, but actually what I'd like to do is say that's one of your options. If you want to look at the story about Joshua and the spies, you're going to be taking a look at Numbers 13, specifically 1 through 3, and then 25 through the end of the chapter. If you've got enough time, you can glance over the intervening verses as well. So that's one option. You can look at the story about the spy. You can look at Joshua as a leader, particularly looking at Joshua 1 through 9, and you'll see one of the questions is also going to dip into Deuteronomy, another part of the Pentateuch that we're really not looking at in depth. Then there's Joshua the general, which is Joshua 6 through 7. And then there's the time of the judges, which is Judges 1. So I'd say hopefully some of you have already had a chance to read all of these and then just pick which one you want to discuss. But if you didn't get a chance to read previously, pick one and go ahead and refresh yourself on what happens in those passages. Okay. Let's start. How many of you decided to take the very first one there and look at Joshua the spy? How many of you are looking at Joshua the spy and willing to give us some answers? Okay, very good. So if we take a look in Numbers, so page number for Numbers 13, remember not 3. 3 is what it says on the sheet, and that's my apologies. 121 in the Pew Bible. Now for starters, we have to pause enough to review, because it's not really in the text right here. Where are the Israelites and what are they doing at this point? Does anybody know, as of this moment, the spies are about to be sent into Canaan, but where are the Israelites? They've come through the wilderness, so after the Red Sea, after they go to Mount Sinai, they've received the law. They go pretty much a straight path from Sinai to Canaan, which is Canaan is basically picture modern day Israel, right? So they go and they're on the southern end. They're looking into Israel from the south, which is of course the most direct route from Egypt. So although they've come from the Sinai Peninsula, there is debate about exactly where was Mount Sinai, which is also called Mount Horeb. Where was that located? There's debate about where did God give the law to Moses, and I don't know if we're ever going to fully answer that debate entirely. There are some arguments to be made for a couple of different places. But it's agreed that it's probably on the Arabian Peninsula, so they basically have made a straight route out there and then up. They were supposed to go back to where the burning bush was, remember? And then from the burning bush to the land that had been promised to Abraham. So there's a lot of history behind what they're doing. So they're in the southern part. They're looking into the promised land that had been promised hundreds of years ago to Abraham. And what are they doing there? Well, they're a nation of former slaves. So they're there to hopefully take occupation of the land that God had promised to give them. All right? So then, verses 1 through 3 of Numbers 13, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a chief among them." So Moses sent them from the wilderness of Paran, according to the command of the Lord, all of them men who were heads of the people of Israel. And in that list is going to be Joshua. He's one of the ones who is sent in as one of the spies. The other major name that's going to come up a few times if you're studying this passage is Caleb. Yes? Where they are and what they're doing. They're outside the promised land. They've been coming in, they were spies, or they were slaves. So they're hoping to enter the promised land on their journey from slavery into becoming a nation. So, yep, that's where they are, that's what they're doing. So spies are sent in, one from each of the 12 tribes. You'll see the last one, Moses called Hoshea, the son of Nun, Joshua. So that sounds really weird, but they're just two different forms of the Lord saves. So it's not as strange as it might seem. So Joshua is one of them. Caleb is one of them. Those two are going to factor pretty importantly. Moses gives them the instruction about how they're supposed to go in and spy out the land and everything. What did the spies recommend? This is what starts in verses 25 and following. What was the spies' recommendation? Yeah, go ahead, Alex. They don't want to go in. That's exactly right. They say not to go in. Now, why? Is it because the land is really crummy and it's not worth living there? Actually, the land is really nice. It says it's flowing with milk and honey. Now, I don't think that means there's actually little bubbling springs of milk and little bubbling springs of honey, but that the land is so rich that you'd have to be an idiot not to be able to successfully farm and raise things there. So if we live there, it's a land of plenty. We'll live with abundance. But they still don't recommend why going in. Why do they not want to go? Yes, Al. Because the people are giants. There be giants there. That's right, verse 28. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. Besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of Negeb. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites dwell in the hill country. The Canaanites dwell by the sea and the Jordan. And a little bit later on here, so Caleb's saying, no, wait, we can go up. We can do this. But the men say we can't. They're stronger than us. And they say, I love this image here in verse 33. We saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak who come from the Nephilim. We seem to ourselves like grasshoppers. And so we seemed to them. So we don't know exactly. This is one of those Old Testament mysteries that has been written about a great deal more than what we actually know. Which it seems to be, we know that Goliath, who's going to show up later, is going to mention that he's also this lineage from the sons of Anak. We know he was 9 feet tall. So there doesn't seem to be any metaphor being used. These are just really huge dudes. It's this one particular genealogical family that were just particularly large, and they felt like grasshoppers around them, which was not, I don't think, a praise. I don't think that was a statement of confidence. So they say, no, don't send the people into the land. There's big people there. Now I have to pause things enough to say, what has just happened in Israel's history? They've just come out of Egypt. They've just seen God defeat all of the Egyptian gods with all of the plagues. They've just had the Red Sea parted for them to walk through and then close on Pharaoh's army. They've just seen miracle after miracle after miracle. And now what they're saying is, no, we can't go in there. They're big. Caleb's like, wait, what? They're like, no, you don't understand. They're really big. Okay, they're big. Are they bigger than all of Egypt's army? Are they bigger than the entire Egyptian empire that God just brought to its knees with no effort at all? So it's amazing, but it's another one of these situations where as soon as we're faced with the challenge, what we see instead of God's vast power, all we can see is how big the challenge looks to us. I think we can relate when we're honest. We tend toward the same thing. It's not a good look, them saying we can't go in there, there's tall people. But what do they decide to do? How do they respond? And this dips into Numbers chapter 14. All you got to do is look at the heading. The people rebel. So all the congregation raise a loud cry, they weep, they grumble against Moses and Aaron. These are all like the greatest hits of the Israelites for the next 40 years. You want to understand the next 40 years, just read this verse. Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or that we died in the wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to one another, let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. And then Moses actually intercedes for the people, asking that God would pardon their iniquity instead of destroying them, even though he's the one they're rejecting. So that's pretty big of Moses to be willing to do. But what are the consequences for the people's decision in verses 20 through 25 of Numbers 14? They don't trust God. So the Lord says in verse 20, I've pardoned according to your word. This is to Moses who interceded for them. I've pardoned according to your word, but truly, as I live and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of the men who've seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and the wilderness, but have yet put me to the test these 10 times and have not obeyed my voice, none of those men shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers. None of those who despised me shall see it. But my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land into which he went, and his descendants shall possess it. And we see later this, of course, applies to Joshua as well, the only 2 of the 12 spies who were faithful. Now, since the Amalekites and the Canaanites dwell in the valleys, turn tomorrow and set out for the wilderness by the way to the Red Sea. By the way, to the Red Sea. As in the Red Sea that they just had crossed. Now they're going back. Right, we're starting this thing again, and now, instead of it being what should have been about a 6 or 7 day journey, instead, 40 years. 40 years until the whole generation who were so quick to forget God's faithfulness, 40 years until they've all passed away in the wilderness, and a whole new generation is going to receive. God's still going to honor his promise, but not with those who refused to trust him. Not with those who refused to believe him. He's waited this many generations. He can wait another generation. So the rest of the book of Numbers, and it's going to touch on it in some of the other Pentateuch books, is about the wanderings in the wilderness for those 40 years and the events that take place for those 40 years. So that's how to take a 1-week journey and turn it into an entire generation, is to fail to trust God when he has made his very clear promise. course, the Israelites, and this is also kind of fun, verse 39 of that same chapter, Moses told these words to the people of Israel, and the people mourned greatly. So they rose early in the morning and went up to the heights and said, "Here we are, we'll go up to the place that the Lord promised." So they say, "Oh wait, okay, all right, we'll go." And now God is like, "Hold on, guys, that was a limited offer and it has expired." But they go anyway and get defeated by the big people. Exactly what they were afraid would have happened if God had not been with them does happen, because God is now not with them. So the victory was assured if God was with them. Defeat is assured without God. So obviously a great deal we can learn there, and more that we could discuss. Any thoughts or questions with that before we bounce along with our survey? Yeah, Dave.
Yeah, just a question on human nature in that second generation. Would not they have been equally as upset and gone through the same sorts of things to rebel against God and kind of perpetuate and continue to happen again?
Wouldn't it be nice if the next generation weren't about to perpetuate it again? But, as we're going to see, no such luck. As we're going to see, we turn into Joshua and then into Judges, and we're going to see they have some very specific instructions that they're supposed to follow as they go into the land. Instructions which they're not going to follow, and then we're going to see the results of that. And we're going to see that over and over and over again. Basically, from this point forward in the Old Testament, it's a lot of rinse and repeat. Because you're going to have separate generations repeating the same mistakes. Every once in a while there will be a breakthrough, but the breakthroughs are the faithful moments, which are few and far between. They're islands in the sea of unfaithfulness to God. So unfortunately, their lack of trust in Numbers 14 really prefigures what we're going to see happening through the rest of the Old Testament. Yep. So, but you can understand now the next generation, like I think where you're going maybe is kind of strategically, if the people who actually saw these events with their own eyes and were old enough to understand what was happening didn't trust God, what are the likely chances that the next generation would? Right? I mean, in a way, it's like God made it even less likely, because at least they'd seen the plagues, they'd seen the Red Sea. They weren't 3 or 5 when it happened, they were adults. And now the people who were 3 or 5 are not even born yet. They're going to be the ones who are charged with following God's will. A challenge that unfortunately they don't rise to particularly well. But Joshua is a bit of an exception to that. So turning to Joshua chapter 1 through 9, we're skipping over Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy literally means a second giving of the law. That's what Deuteros is second and Nomos is law. So it's a recap, essentially, of all the laws that God gave. Yes, Alex, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just saying, how old was Moses when this happened?
How does he what?
How old?
How old is Moses at this point? It's an excellent question. I'd have to look it up. They don't give us ages a whole lot. So we'd have to look and see. It's not something that has stuck in my memory if at any point they did tell us Moses' age. We know he's old enough that he's already been raised a prince, he's already run from Egypt, he's already been called to go and set the people free. We know he has children, we know he has a wife, so he's an adult, at least, by the time this takes place. But we don't know. Is he in his 20s, 30s, 40s? We don't really know at this stage, unless it is mentioned somewhere. Ken?
Yeah, I think I read somewhere that Moses went through 3 40-year stages.
Oh,
40 years in
that
Egypt,
rings a bell.
40 years when he was off escaping, and then 40 years leading the...
That does ring a bell, and then I'd have to see if it rings a bell because it's in the scriptures somewhere or not. But that may be right. I feel like it's maybe something that Paul writes about somewhere. But that Moses has 3 40-year stages. So basically 40 years till he's cast out of Egypt, 40 years in the wilderness, and then 40 years leading the Israelites. That does ring a bell. We could do a little homework and find out if that's the case. Because if that's the case, then Moses is already 80 by the time that this is taking place. Yeah, Kathy?
So Moses didn't go into the promised land, right?
Right.
He was allowed. So in Deuteronomy 34, verse 5,
Yep.
7 says, Moses was 120 years old when he died.
Excellent, thank you. Oh yeah, there it is. So you're right, he's got to have been 80 because we know it's 40 years of wandering. Yep, okay, very good. Excellent, thank you. Crowdsourcing the answer there. Yep, so Moses is 80. at the time that this is taking place. If he's 120 when he dies, and he doesn't get to enter into the promised land. In fact, we're going to touch on that in just a second. So, but if we go back all the way, so hold your spot if you already went to Joshua 1, but we're going to back up to Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 15. Because this kind of sets the stage. And notice it's put Deuteronomy is the second giving of the law, the reminder for all the people, hey, here's where we're at, especially in regards to what God's expecting from us. And then we have, and this is a very famous prayer, it's called the Shema, because the first word of it is Shema, which is hear. That, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. That ought to sound familiar. Jesus taught about that a bit. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets before your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And when the Lord your God, this is verse 10 of Deuteronomy 6, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give you, with great and good cities that you did not build, and houses full of all good things that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant. And when you eat and are full, then take care. Watch yourself is another way you could translate this. Then take care lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It is the Lord your God you shall fear. Him you shall serve, and by his name you shall swear. You shall not go after other gods, the gods of the peoples who are around you. For the Lord your God in your midst is a jealous God, lest the anger of the Lord your God be kindled against you, and he destroy you from off the face of the earth. So the warning there, when you go into the land and I give you all these wonderful things that you yourself did not invest and build, don't forget God. Don't start worshiping the other gods, because that's going to end really, really badly. A little foreshadowing here, right? Very heavy foreshadowing, because that's exactly what's about to happen. But first, we'll see Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. So before Moses dies in the inner land, what are they reminded? To serve God only, to worship God only. Now here, we read Joshua 1, 1 through 9. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I'm giving them, to the people of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, just as I promised to Moses. There's some geographic discussion there. Verse 5, no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so shall I be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Ought to sound very familiar. Echoes, Jesus is going to echo this with his Great Commission. Verse 6, be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. Joshua causes them to inherit it, but God's the one who is giving it. Very clear there. Only be strong and very courageous. Then down in verse 9, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Surely Joshua is getting the point here, to be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened, do not be dismayed. The Lord your God is with you wherever you go. All right, so the question here, which is worthy of discussion, would it have been easy or hard for Joshua to be a leader after Moses' death? And I think you can answer either. I think there are legit reasons that you can support either position. So, Al, you got a hand up first. What do you think?
I think it'd be very hard.
Hard. Why do you think it'd be hard?
Because they're going to get what they want, the promised land, right?
Yep.
But then they're going to complain because it might not be good enough. So they're going to come to, what's his name? Joshua?
Yep.
They're going to say, we want more stuff.
Yep. He's seen the way they behave, right? It's hard because he's going to have to take Moses' position, but Moses' position was a hard position. People constantly upset with God and taking it out on Moses, right? Okay, that's a fair point. Who else thinks it would be hard to be Joshua after Moses? Who else thinks it would be hard? Anybody else think about any other reasons in addition to what Al shared that it would be hard to follow after Moses?
You've got 40 years in you.
Yeah, Moses has already been doing 40 years, right? So you've been serving with him. He was old enough to serve as a spy, so Joshua's no spring chicken at this point. Presumably he's at least in his 60s, right? I mean, if he was old enough to be sent out, maybe at the youngest he's 58, but he's not like, we know the energy we had when we were in our 20s, and if we're not in our 20s anymore, we know it's not the same level energy, right? And so he's got that in front of him as well. What else? Yeah, Carol.
Well, the people were familiar with Moses.
Yep.
They knew how he operated, and so Joshua's a brand new figure, and it's
Yep.
also prove yourself to us.
Yep. You got to prove yourself. Are you can you do what Moses did? They know Moses, even as often as they rebelled against him. But for 40 years, he's been their leader. He's a new kid on the block. Joshua is. So, what are you capable of? Yeah, Don.
Moses had the first-hand experience of God.
Moses had met God firsthand in the burning bush, right? I mean, Moses could always fall back on that. Joshua had seen all of the plagues and all of the Red Sea, everything. He's one of the few people who was an eyewitness at this point, which hopefully raises his stature a bit. But yeah, can he fall back on the certainty of calling that Moses could fall back on? Yeah, that's a challenge. Any other thoughts there? How many leaders has the nation of Israel ever had? Just one, right? They weren't a nation when they went down into Egypt. They went down into Egypt, they were Joseph. That was the whole list, right? And then when everything happened with the famine, then the whole family comes. Then they grow numerous while they're in Egypt. Now they've been rescued at the hand of, we know it was by God, but at the hand of Moses. Moses is the only leader they've ever had. So in addition to all the history that's being lost, you're only the second one. That's not an easy position. It's a very fascinating study to be done. If I had gone on before I went to seminary, this is what I wanted to study was how well does the second CEO do after the founder retires? Because it's a really interesting thing, and what traits are necessary for the second CEO after the retirement of a founder to be able to succeed versus fail, that sort of thing. That always interested me, and that's what this is. Moses was the founder and CEO of People of Israel, Inc., right? Just because he's the only one they had, right? He was the only leader. Now it's Joseph's turn. All right, those are all the reasons that or Joshua's turn, excuse me. Those are the reasons it would be hard, but I think you can make a case for things that would argue for it being easier. What are the things that would have argued for it potentially being easy? Can anybody think of any? Yeah, John.
He's the last one from his generation that's still around.
Yeah, there's just him and Caleb. That's it. So, by natural, especially in a society that's taught that the elders are the ones that are supposed to make the decisions. Obviously, we've celebrated youth for a long time in our Western culture. But in that culture, the elders of the city sat at the gate and made the decisions. They were the ones with the most experience. So, so he was there. He saw all those things firsthand. He's one of the longest standing, and he was Moses' assistant for all those years, too. Gary.
They also facing the prospect of finally getting out of the desert.
They're finally getting out of the desert. Yeah, this is like being elected president just before the economy rebounds. Right? That's a good thing, right? Whether you made any decision or not, we're leaving the desert and that's a good thing, right? What are some other reasons that it potentially should be easy? Yeah.
Because he wasn't Moses.
Because he what?
Because he was not Moses.
Because he's not Moses.
Who they grumbled against.
They grumble against? Yep.
Good guy, we're going to get rid of all that stuff we didn't like.
It's time to start over. Yep, so at least maybe you get a little honeymoon period at the beginning, right? Doesn't last long, but you do get one. Yeah, Al.
I'm just thinking that since Moses died, and they could take advantage of Joshua, even though Joshua has experience because he was the assistant of Moses.
Right.
They could still possibly manipulate him into making decisions that might not be good for everyone in that group.
Yep.
Especially for that one individual.
Yep.
So
So
that would be a hard decision to make.
this puts it in the hard category again, is how do you keep 12 different tribes united as one people? Yep, so that's its own unique challenge, which we're going to see as well. But I think the biggest thing where you could make the case for it still should be a relatively, I don't know if easy is the right word, but a reason for confidence. What if I put it that way? What's the biggest reason for confidence Joshua should still have? Adam, go ahead.
Well, God promises.
God promised it. Yep, he's still got guys. Is that what you're going to say too, Dave?
That guy commissioned.
God commissioned him. God is still on their side. And God is the one who's saying, hey, listen, I remember this was the promise. I said it's going to be 40 years. It's been 40 years. God's still on their side, right? So in theory, is it a hard job for Joshua? You bet. Is it a hard job for God? Nope. And whose responsibility is it? It's God's responsibility. God's authority. That's being delegated to Joshua. So I think we can go through kind of the whole range of emotions. We certainly can surmise at least what God thought Joshua most needed to hear. Because what does he say 3 times in Joshua 1 through 9? Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Here's it over and over again. And I got to be honest with you. If my commission, if somebody was sending me out onto, just any kind of task, and kept repeating, be strong and courageous. The first time I hear it, I'm like, yeah, I'm going to be strong and courageous. The second time I'd hear it, like, yep, I heard that. The third time I hear it, I'm like, why are you thinking? Yeah, I was feeling strong and courageous. Well, maybe a little foreshadowing there. And what is Joshua's promise that God ends with there? Do not be frightened, do not be dismayed. The Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Very, very, very similar to Jesus' commissioning of his own disciples in Matthew 28. All right, so then we get the first chance to see Joshua the general. I'm going to try to wrap us up in the next just couple of minutes here. Even without having to read all of Joshua chapter 6, can somebody just give us a simple answer of what happened at Jericho and what does that teach us? This is one of those great Sunday school lessons that if you grew up in the church, you've known the story of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho probably your entire life. So who can give me just the one sentence? There you go. Yep, and the walls. Yep, the walls came tumbling down, right? So the craziest attack plan in the history of the world was the attack plan for Jericho, which is this great walled city. At one point it says they're several feet thick, the walls, and it's very fortified. And it's just on the east side of the Jordan River. So what have I skipped, by the way? Chapter 3, Israel crosses the Jordan River. You want a wonderful affirmation from God that Joshua really is the man? Moses becomes the leader of a nation pretty much at the same time that God parts the Red Sea and brings the people through. Joshua's turn, and how does God commemorate the event? Part the Jordan River, and into the promised land we go. And I got to be honest with you, parting a sea, a sea obviously has waves and everything, but it's a kind of a static body of water. Parting a river is interesting, isn't it? It's flowing water. So what does that look like? Either way, obviously it's a wonderful, wonderful assurance from God. Yep, I'm the same God, and this guy's my guy, and you guys are still my people, despite the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. They parted the Red Sea to come out of Egypt. God parts the Jordan River to go into the promised land. So that's just happened. But you cross the Jordan River and now you're bang smack against the first fortified city. How's that going to go? Remember what God's battle plan was? Walk around it. Yep, for 6 days, just march around it one time. Then on the last day, the 7th day, march around it 7 times. And at the end of the 7 times, blow your trumpets and shout. That's my plan. Now imagine God delivers this instruction to you, and you're Joshua. And now you get to go sell this to the people of Israel. You're coming off this high point. You've just crossed the Jordan River. They're eager to hear what you have to say. It's like, all right, guys, here's my plan. And they're thinking, oh, shoot, did that water start running again? Because if not, I might head back, right? And yet, of course, they follow God's instruction. As silly as it sounds, they just march around. And the thing of it here is, all right, try to think as even a medieval strategist or an ancient Near Eastern strategist. Marching your entire people around the city more than once is a really, really dumb strategic move. Why?
Get shot at.
Well, you can get shot at without getting shot back. Now, maybe they march far enough away that nothing's getting shot at them or dropped at them. So maybe at least they do that. Why is this still a really bad idea?
Well, the enemy can see how many of you there are.
And if they miscounted on the first day, yeah, enemy can see exactly how many of you there are. And if they miscounted on the first day, they can double check the count on day 2 and triple check and quadruple check. There are no secrets here. There's no strategery, right? This is just showing, this is all we got, guys. And of course, they're thinking, this is an entire nation of lunatics. What on earth are they doing? But when they blow the trumpets, when they make the shouts, the walls crumble. Of course, there's been modern day theories. Did they somehow manage to hit just the right resonant frequency? If you ever heard about that, resonant frequencies that can cause things to tumble or whatever. It's like, okay, even if that's the scientific explanation, isn't it a miracle that that resonant frequency was exactly what that crowd would produce for the walls to tumble down? I don't care if that's the means God used. It's still a miracle. And the walls fall down, and the people rush in, and God wins. It's fantastic, right? But there's a problem. Oh, go ahead, Daniel.
Just one tiny thing, I don't remember this before. The walls fall down, Rahab's people are still safe, right? Because they can go into the house and bring them out. But it says in 3 that her house is built into the wall.
Yep. So what presumably we have to picture is probably a little bit different. So the walls in medieval cities could be the housing of the poorer, because obviously if a wall gets breached, then somebody's breaking into your house. But these wide walls, I think at one point it gets described as being 8 or 9 feet thick. Well, that's big enough to put rooms in, right? And still be a wall. So that's why Rahab, I mean, we know that she's having to make money as a prostitute, so obviously times are not good for Rahab. She's not independently wealthy and still serving as a prostitute. So, and the fact that her house is built into the wall. And then it says, because remember the spies went in, they did the whole scoping it out thing, that she leaves the red strand hanging from the window, which sometimes has been tied to the red strand of Jesus' blood, some foreshadowing there perhaps. But how is it possible that it says the walls fall down, but Rahab's family is fine, but Rahab's family's house is in the wall, right? Well, I think probably realistically, we don't have to picture the entire encircling wall, the whole thing everywhere, just flattening to nothing. The point of a wall is that there's no openings in it. So any breach in the wall, and you've just lost all of the strategic value of having a wall, right? Because if the opposing army can come in, any wall that remains is now just trapping you, not helping you. So whether we picture the entirety of the wall falling down and just Rahab's house left standing, which, hey, God could do. He kept sending plagues on Egypt and not on the Israelites. Or was it that just enough of the wall fell down strategically for the Israelites to breach it? Either way, it's a miracle. But Rahab's family is preserved, as God had promised. The Israelites are able to breach the wall. And actually, Rahab ends up getting a shout out in Jesus' own genealogy, which is a wonderful thing, too. Even though she's very much not an Israelite, nor a woman of good repute at the time. There's a problem, though. The problem is this, and it's something it really foreshadows the rest of the book of Joshua. Chapter 6, verse 17, has a little tidbit tucked in there that's really important. Verse 17, the city and all that is within it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. All right? So other than Rahab and her family, every living being in there, all the possessions in there, they are all to be, this phrase, devoted to the Lord for destruction. It's a very specific phrase in Hebrew. It's harem, and it means offered to God 100%. Right? This isn't a 10% tithe business where you get to keep 90% and you're supposed to give away 10%. Everything is supposed to be for God and for God alone, which in this case means destroyed. Now, it's a pretty simple instruction, right? I mean, we leave aside the ethical considerations for the moment, etc. But if I told you, go in that room and destroy everything that you find, you shouldn't be picking up everything and saying, am I supposed to destroy that one? Am I supposed to, it's 100% clear. Everything's supposed to get destroyed. Why would that be hard? A lot of reasons I think you can come up with, but why do you think that would be hard? Carol?
Well, if somebody sees something valuable,
Somebody sees something valuable, what are they going to want to do?
they're going to take it.
They're going to want to take it.
Just like soldiers in
Yep, soldiers in pretty much every war that's ever been
Take
fought.
that.
Right? Spoils of war is the phrase for a reason, right? Okay, Dave?
It's horrific what they did in terms of having to kill everything and everyone.
Yep.
And destroy everything.
Yep.
And I think another thing I'm thinking about is, well, how would they actually do it by the sword? And so you have this band of ragtag people that have very little resources, and then they're supposed to pay. And they did, they put down the entire city.
Yep. I mean, you think the adrenaline might take over for the initial rush, but what about killing the people who didn't get killed in the initial rush? That's not a pleasant prospect to think about, right? So that's another reason that it's kind of rough. And they've been wandering around in the wilderness for the last 40 years. They haven't had a home. Now all of a sudden, I'm in the market for a couch. Haven't had one yet, but I'm in the market now, and that's a really nice couch. And setting it on fire doesn't make a whole lot of sense, even if my team did just win the Super Bowl or whatever, right? Even if my people did just win, destroying everything, I don't know about that. But God had been very plain. This is in a microcosm for what's supposed to happen in the entire land. In the entire land, everybody's supposed to get wiped out. It is supposed to be populated 100% by God's chosen people and by God's chosen people alone. That's why it's significant that God had told Abraham, not yet, not until the wickedness of the people has reached its fullness. Remember when I was talking with Abraham last week about how God did, and a few weeks previous when we had studied Abraham, there were other religions that required child sacrifice, for instance. Where do you suppose those religions were mostly located? In the cities that the chosen people are supposed to be taking over now. Study ancient Near Eastern history of the cultures like the Amalekites and some of these various ones who are being mentioned. Study those cultures and then see if you still feel comfortable applying the term innocent victims. I don't think you can. Especially when you think of, were they innocent of being soldiers? Yeah, perhaps. Innocent of sin? Nope. And if God has chosen his people to be his measure for delivering punishment of sin, is that pleasant? No. Should they relish that role? I hope not. Should they fulfill that role? Yes, they should. Especially given the warning that's been given. Don't forget God when you go into the lands. Don't forget the one who really gave it to you. Danielle.
Also, it says that, in Rahab says, gives witness to like how much they've heard. So clearly this was like the water cooler. Everybody knows what happened to Israelites and Egyptians, so everybody had the chance.
Yep.
And only they believed. So
Yep. Yeah, and in fact, it's an excellent point because Rahab already knows what God did, even those 40 years previous. Rahab already knows what God did on their behalf to the Egyptians. So when Jericho chooses not to surrender, when Jericho chooses to go into siege mode, and this is the one other thing that's, I think, historically very valuable, is if you've ever studied anything, like I said, this goes up through the medieval times, there were two things you could do when your city was being attacked. You could either negotiate terms for peace, or you could go into full-bore siege mode. And it was understood, and this even applies like when people get really critical of the Crusades, and I'm not wanting to defend them, but you at least need to understand the culture in which they happened. If you're in charge of a city, and an army is coming, you're going to be given the opportunity by that army to negotiate terms for peace. If you choose not to, if you go into siege mode, then it is understood by all parties involved that once the siege overtakes your city, they're welcome to whatever they can get. That's the deal. It's total warfare at that point, and that's understood by everybody. There's no such thing left as a civilian once you've decided that you're not going to negotiate for the well-being of your civilians. That's why it's such a big deal when a city is willing to try to withstand a siege instead of negotiating peace. And that's where we're at with Jericho. Jericho is not sending out people to negotiate peace. And apparently the demonstration of circular marching on day one did not change their minds. Right? So we also have to understand that in that setting, that's exactly what Jericho would have been expecting. By the time they're conquered, they're knowing that's it. Where this was a live or die moment, right? It was all or nothing, and we're ending up with nothing. So, does it make us more comfortable with it? No. Am I okay with the fact that it doesn't make us more comfortable with it? No. I am okay with it. We shouldn't be comfortable with it. But it was understood at the time in a way that's harder for us in our own culture to understand for a lot of different reasons. The people's own wickedness, God's own warnings and promises, and the culturally accepted warfare techniques at the time, they all point toward why full destruction was what should have happened. All right, Al.
Just thinking, Jericho was it a circular city?
I mean, at some point, if the walls connect, it's something resembling a circle. You know, is it kind of squarish? Is it kind of... It did get rebuilt later, which they warned about not to do, and that comes up again in the Old Testament. It's going to be well below the level of detail we're going to be looking at. But we don't know for sure what its exact shape was. So was it a circle? Was it a square? Was it a hexagon? We don't know entirely. Every reason to believe it would have followed whatever made most sense geographically for where it was located. Yeah. But trying to read destruction layers and stuff archaeologically can get really involved. So trying to come up with a clear city map would be a little difficult. Yeah. So what was the problem? We're actually going to wrap this up relatively quickly, but what does Achan do? He takes the couch. He's in the market for a couch. It's a nice sleeper sofa, right? People of Israel broke faith in regard, this is chapter 7, verse 1, broke faith in regard to the devoted things, the herem, that word that I mentioned. Achan, the son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of the devoted things, and the anger of the Lord burned against the people of Israel. He stashes the things in the midst of his campsite, which would be all of his people. So this isn't like, because his whole family is about to pay the price here, but the whole family became accomplices after the fact when they didn't turn him in. The fascinating thing is they go to attack this tiny little city, and they get defeated. And then they're like, hang on, we just defeated the big city. Why did we lose to the little city? And God says, because you didn't follow my rules. So then it's time to figure out, and they draw lots by all of these different groupings. And man, I'm glad I was not Achan on that day. It's like, please don't pick Judah. Please don't pick Judah. Oh, phooey. You know, and it keeps worrying, please don't pick Zerah. Please don't pick Zerah. Zerah! Oh, man. They're working their way down to figure out as God reveals who the person is. And note, Achan never stands up and admits it until after God has already fingered him, right? Confession doesn't mean a whole lot when you've already been proven guilty, right? Would have meant a lot more earlier. And so he and his whole family are to be devoted to destruction now, because they have chosen to keep for themselves the things that are devoted to destruction. They become things that are devoted to destruction. Then they go up and they're able to defeat the city of Ai quite easily. And quite convincingly. But here we see a foreshadowing in a small setting for the problem in the large setting. The people of Israel are supposed to enter into the promised land and clear everybody out. Do they? Nope. As soon as they clear out enough to live in, they decide that's good enough, time to start farming. And that leaves the people there, and it leaves all of the gods that they worship there. And which gods do you suppose they end up following? All of them. But Yahweh's not okay with being one item on the menu. Right? Yahweh's supposed to be the entire list. And so what happens, and we're not going to take a look, although you can, the book of Judges is absolute chaos. Because over and over, the phrase that you're going to see, and it doesn't mean it in a good way, is that the people of Israel did what was right in their own eyes. Each one did what was right in their own eyes, and my goodness, is it a mess. That's part of why I would, if we had more time, have you read Judges chapter 1. It's just a mess. This person attacked that person and went to this place, and they attacked that person, but then this person betrayed that person. It just becomes this absolute, you can't even really keep the thread, because the people are rejecting God's plan. We can draw a pretty straight line from Adam to Noah to Abraham to Moses. It's all a clear narrative. Even despite people's failings, it becomes absolute mud once they get into the promised land, and is going to continue that way. We're going to go ahead and take a look at King David next week, and I've got the sheets to hand out to you if you want to use. Actually, not next week. Next week's Easter, you may have heard. So the week after, we'll go ahead and take a look at the life of David. But the whole point is, it's a mess. What should have been happening instead of what did happen. And actually, the quick survey of Judges 1, verse 27, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants. Verse 29, Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites. Verse 30, Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants. 31, Asher did not drive out the inhabitants. 33, you're picking up the theme, right? Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants, etc. And then the problem is they end up following all of the other gods instead. Do they enter the promised land? Yes. Do they ever get to really fully inhabit all those things that God promised? No. Because as soon as they entered, they chose comfort over faithfulness, and they're going to pay the price for as long as they're there. And even that's not going to be forever. Even though it had been promised it would be if they followed God, they're going to get kicked right back out and into slavery. It's going to take several hundred years of God's patience, but it's still where it's pointed. So, if you wanted to pick an overall theme, it's trusting in God even when it doesn't seem to make sense, even when parts of it seem to be distasteful to us. Trusting that God has more power and more perspective than we could ever have. And there's also a valuable lesson to be said in being rather, not unkind, but yet rather ruthless in removing anything that would take our loyalty from God onto itself. Even when Jesus would later say, if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out, or your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. That's part of what he's getting at. Anything that you know is consistently going to pull you away from Christ, do what you can to get rid of it. That's why we even pray, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Unfortunately, the Israelites were really okay with living among temptation, and they had to pay the price. So, let's close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks that despite our repeated unfaithfulness as humans, you are demonstrably and perfectly and consistently faithful to us. We see over and over again, we've already seen it, the way that you fulfill your promise even when we do not. And so thank you for that faithfulness, and as we live in that promise, we pray that you would go with us on this day. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, thanks very much, everybody. Next week, we get to study a bit, not next week, 2 weeks from now, get to study a bit about David. If you would like the handout, it's right up here. In fact, I'll leave it. Put a little stack of them here, and I put a little stack of them over here, too.
I'll get them out.
Oh, okay. Margaret will hand them out to you.